At its peak in 1977, 21.1 million people in Britain alone were watching The Benny Hill Show on a single night.
A show like no
That
other
number
had been
does not
born.
include the audience in France, where he was treated as a comedy auteur comparable to the great silent film
Hill's
directors.
success in marrying
It does not
live
include
performance,
Germany,
feeding off their
Australia,
reactions,
Japan,
and
or the United
occasionally
States,
improvising in
where his
response.
show aired in syndication and attracted the kind of devoted following that most American television programs spent years and millions of
camaraderie
dollars
between
trying to
Hill and his
manufacture.
ensemble
At
created
one
a
point,
natural
The Benny
rhythm
Hill
and
Show
charm.
was being broadcast in over 140 countries simultaneously. A California jail
world
once
that was
descended into a
constantly
riot
changing,
when inmates were
The answer
prevented
to
from
that
watching
would
it.
become clear.
A senior
Made him
figure
a
in the
favorite
American
among
Mafia
audiences.
agreed to participate in a documentary with Thames Television only on the condition that they arrange for Benny
The
Hill to
palpable
perform
chemistry
at his
between
Las
Hill and
Vegas
Wright,
casino.
symbolizing
By
a growing
1989,
divide
the
between
audience
those
in
who saw
Britain
the show
had
as
fallen
harmless
to
fun
9.58 million viewers for the final Thames episode. That number, which would
Hill's
represent
once
an enormous
celebrated brand
success
of
for
humor
almost any
started
other
to feel
program
the
on
heat.
British
The
television,
more the criticism
was considered
intensified,
a terminal
it gradually
decline.
became obvious
Thames
that not
Television
everyone found
canceled
the
the
joke.
contract, and the man who had made them a fortune selling comedy to the entire world was
Even
dismissed.
though the show still
In the
enjoyed
words of
some
his
following,
agent Richard Stone,
it started to become
like a
more
schoolboy.
apparent. Producing
Alfred
the Benny
Hawthorne
Hill
Hill
Show
was
had
born
become
on
increasingly
January
expensive,
21st,
and as
1924
rating
in Southampton, the son of a man who managed a surgical appliance store and had
in a more
spent time
progressive
as a
era.
circus clown.
While the
Comedy
show's
was in the
cancellation
family,
marked the
but
end
the
of an
path
era,
to it was not
yet Hill
obvious.
was noted for his
Hill
frugality.
was not a gifted student. He was a gifted observer, watching his teachers and classmates
He was
and
never
finding
one
the
to
angle
splash
on each
money
of
on
them
luxury
that made
and
the room
embraced
laugh.
by millions.
He was reprimanded for it
This
regularly.
sense of longing for the
He kept
past,
doing it anyway. After school, he worked as a milkman, a driver, a bridge operator,
bygone
and a
era
drummer
of comedy,
before finding his way
one that
into
was willing
touring
to
review
push the
work in the
boundaries
early
and take
1940s.
risks.
It was
Don't
during
forget
this
to like
period
the
that
video
Alfred
and
Hill became
subscribe to
Benny
the
Hill,
channel.
adopting
for
the
watching.
stage name as a tribute to his idol Jack Benny, the American comedian whose comic timing
too
he
did the
studied with a
public's
devotion
appetite
that
for his
bordered
brand
on
of comedy.
obsession. The name
The scene
change
in
was
question,
not superficial.
In the early 1940s,
It represented a conscious decision about who he was going to be and what kind of comedy he was going to make.
he began
The
performing
Benny
in
Hill
various
Show
variety
first aired
shows.
on
The
BBC on
innovation
January
begged
15,
one question.
1955,
How
and
long
immediately
could Benny Hill
demonstrated
sit-
something that British television had not quite seen before. Hill understood that the camera
Often
was
featuring
not
Hill
simply a
performing
device
comedic
for
songs
recording a
laced with
performance.
double entendres.
It was a tool that could enhance, accelerate, and transform comedy in ways that a live
While the
stage
Benny
never
Hill
could.
Show was known for its
Pre-recorded
humor,
sketches
it
allowed
also
him to
pushed
play multiple
boundaries.
characters
But
within
one
a single
question
scene.
remained.
Rapid editing could compress a chase sequence into something that moved at a speed no live
Could Benny
performance
Hill's
could
brand
sustain.
of comedy
Visual
contain another
effects gave
essential
him
ingredient in the
options that a
recipe of
theater
success
could not
was Hill's
provide.
Angels.
He wrote all his own material, every sketch, every song, every gag, and refined
While
his
Benny
technique
Hill,
with the
in his
same
typical
commitment he had
style,
brought to
made
studying Jack
suggestive
Benny
jokes
as
at their
timing decades
expense.
earlier. The format he developed was genuinely new. Episodes blended live segments,
To him,
pre-recorded
the Benny Hill
sketches,
Show
musical
was not just
numbers, and
outdated,
slapstick chase
but
sequences
harmful.
set to
But
the instrumental
if you actually
Piece
watch
sax,
the shows,
a track that became so inseparable from the show that it eventually became inseparable from the
it's
concept
the
of
men
comedic
who were the
acceleration
targets of his
itself.
humor.
The
One
chases were
concern
the most
executives
famous
had with the
element,
show
and they owed a
was its
specific debt
implication
to the
for their
silent
brand.
film era. To Chaplin and Keaton and the physical logic of comedy that does not require language and
Hill's
therefore does not
longtime
require
broadcaster
translation.
made the
This was
difficult
one of the
decision to
central
cancel the
reasons the
program
show worked
Global
in
Phenomenon.
140 countries. You did not need to speak English to understand what was happening. You just
Beloved
had
for
to
its
watch.
bold,
The
fast-paced
supporting
humor.
cast that
People
developed
who knew
around
him
Hill
said he
across
was
the
kind
Thames
and
years
generous,
added
yet
consistency
very
and
private.
texture to the formula. Jackie Wright, a small, bald actor with an enormous screen
Hill
presence,
frequently looked back
became
with
the recurring
fondness
target of
on the
Hill,
early
his
days
most
of his
famous
career.
running gag. The
However,
rapid-fire
as with
head
any
slap that
cultural
became
figure,
one of the most
Hill's
recognized
legacy
physical
is
comedy
complex.
bits in television history. The performers known as Hill as Angels added choreographic
which aired
dimension,
in the late 1980s,
sketches, and
wasn't
musical
just another
numbers
of
that
Hill's
gave the
cheeky
program
skits.
visual richness
From an
beyond
early age,
pure slapstick.
Benny had this humorous
Together, they
side to
created
his character.
something that felt like a genuine ensemble. But the world the show had been built for was changing.
The world was
And
about
it was
to witness
changing
the
in
rise
ways
of a
that Benny
comedic
Hill was
genius
either
and
unwilling
comedic
or
range.
unable to adapt to. The criticism did not arrive suddenly. It built across most of the
Although the show
1980s
relied
with the
heavily on
specific
pre-recorded
momentum of a
material
cultural shift
of the
that nobody
1960s
fully
and
controlled but everyone
1970s.
could feel. The show's humor had always been risque. Women in revealing
Though many fans
costumes,
embraced
sketches
the edgy
built
humor
on
with its
double entendre,
groundbreaking format,
a recurring
bold
visual grammar
comedic
of men
style,
chasing and
and
being outwitted by
unforgettable
women, which his supporters would later argue was actually the point, that the men in Hill-is comedy
Hill's
were consistently
Angels
the ones who
first appeared
ended
on
up
screen
humiliated.
in the late
But the frame
1970s.
through which audiences
Still,
were now
this
viewing
defense
that
did little
content
to
had
deflect
changed,
the argument against
and the frame
show.
changed the meaning
beauty
regardless of intent. The most vocal and consequential critic was Ben Elton, a
Perhaps the
stand-up
most
comedian
vocal
and writer who
influential
was
of
among
these
the
was
leading
the
figures of
up-and-coming
the alternative comedy
comedian
movement that had
Ben,
emerged in Britain in the early 1980s through Channel 4. Elton
to
was not
exploit
simply
TV's full
dismissive of
potential.
Hill-is work.
He commented,
He was specific and
portrayed as a
sustained in his
misogynist
argument that the format of the show, scantily dressed women pursued by leering men,
or should it
reflected
have a
and reinforced
responsibility
attitudes
to
about
challenge and
women
push
that had
against
real
societal
consequences
norms,
beyond the
was named
television
by the
screen.
British press
He
as
used
the
his
man who
platform
ultimately pulled the
consistently
plug.
and without diplomatic softening to make that case. The response was divided in ways that
After the
precisely
Benny Hill
mirrored
show
the
was
broader
canceled,
cultural argument.
Benny Hill found himself
Those
at a
who agreed with
crossroads.
Elton saw the Benny Hill show as a relic that had outlived both its moment and its defensibility.
He would go to outdoor
Those who
cafes
disagreed saw a
anonymously,
humorless overreach,
traveling on public
comedy being
transport.
held responsible for social problems it had not caused and did not perpetuate in any meaningful way.
In the end,
One newspaper
Benny Hill's
described
later life
Elton
was
as
a mix of
attack as
quiet
resembling
reflection
an elderly
that
uncle
followed in
being
his
kicked
wake.
to death by young
His
thugs.
influence is evident
GQ
in how
magazine
comedy
wrote
evolved.
that blaming Hill for rape statistics was like pointing a finger at concert pianists for causing
and
elephant
controversy.
poaching. Gary
He was a
Bushell, a
comedian
television
who brought
critic
joy
and close
to
friend of Hill,
millions, his slapstick
made the
humor
specific
and playful
counterargument that the
sketches.
show is Defenders most consistently return to. He said that if you actually watched the
But as
program
times
carefully,
changed,
the
and
men
humor
were always
echo
the
beyond
targets.
the borders of
They were
Britain,
the inadequate
or would
ones,
he
the
remain
ones who
just
walked
another-
into lampposts and got slapped, the ones whose schemes collapsed. Women in Hill
the
is
episode
comedy
ended.
consistently ended up with
At
the
the
upper
heart
hand.
of the Benny Hill
The problem,
show,
Bushell
the show became
argued,
a massive
was
success
that critics
both
were
in the
reading
UK
the visual
and
surface of the
internationally.
show, scantily dressed women, without attending to the actual logic of who the comedy was
But
at the
his
expense
success
of.
was not in any
Hill
small
himself
part a
said
testament
very
to
little
the talented
publicly in
supporting
response
cast.
to any of it. He maintained his position that he was an entertainer whose purpose was
and
to
joining
make people
in various
laugh,
comic sketches.
and he was not
The group
persuaded that
added
this
a new
purpose
dimension
required
to the
defense
show.
or adjustment. He later appeared, without complaint, as a character in a Harry Enfield sketch,
augmented by
parroted as
physical comedy.
Benny Elton,
But the
a
cultural
politically
context
correct
had
killjoy
changed.
chased by angry women to the tune of yakety sax for trying to force them to be more feminist.
The
It was a
show
graceful
fostered
and
regressive
genuinely funny
stereotypes,
response from
chiefly
a
in
man
its
who
portrayal of
understood
women.
the specific absurdity of the situation he was in. But the institution that had broadcast
They
him
were
for nearly
inadequate,
2 decades
and the ones
had
who
its
walked
own
into
calculations to
lampposts
make.
and got slapped.
Thames Television
See,
was facing
surrounding
production
the Benny
costs
Hill
that had
show,
reached £450,000 per show, a significant figure even before the
raised
question
some
of declining
profound
ratings
questions
entered
about
the
the role
calculation.
meeting where the
At
decision
its
was
1977
finalized
peak, the show had attracted 21 million viewers. By the end of the
Reportedly
1980s,
tense and
that number
emotional.
had fallen by
Nor
more than
had
half.
children.
The show
and his
was still
personal
profitable
life remained somewhat
internationally.
mysterious to the
Thames
public.
was generating substantial revenue selling the back catalog to broadcasters across the world who were several years
Recognition
behind the UK
that his
in terms of
comedic
audience
style
saturation.
had not always
But a
been
falling
fully
domestic
appreciated.
audience combined with rising production costs and intensifying critical and cultural pressure
What is
created
clear
conditions
is that
that
Benny
made
Hill's
renewal
influence
difficult
on
to justify
comedy is
internally.
strong.
In
Benny
June
Hill would years
1989,
later become
John
one of the
Howard
most
Davies,
recognizable
the head
faces
of
in
Light
comedy.
Entertainment at Thames since March 1988, invited Hill to a meeting. Hill
More
arrived.
elaborate and
The
imaginative
meeting was
scenes
brief.
than would have been
His
possible
contract
in a
was not
traditional.
renewed. His agent Richard Stone later described how Hill had been dismissed like a
who often
schoolboy,
played the butt
an image
of Hill's
that captured
jokes.
something specific about
His
how the
recurring
end
bit,
came. Not with argument or negotiation, but with the quiet administrative finality of
The
a
Benny Hill
decision
show
that had
began to
already
feel
been made
old-fashioned
before he walked through
compared
the
to
door.
newer styles
Hill
of comedy.
had been with Thames for nearly 20 years. He had written every word of every sketch.
He would frequently play
He had never
everything
missed
from
a
the
production
put-upon
commitment.
old man to a
He
bumbling
had helped
sidekick
make the network internationally relevant in a way that predated and outlasted almost every other
that
program
gave
they
it its
produced.
singular flavor.
He left the
made
building
the
and
show
never
a
made
cultural
another television
phenomenon.
program for Thames again. The years after the cancellation were difficult in ways
and the
that his public
responsibilities of
composure
comedians
never fully
to reflect
revealed.
the changing
Hill made
values of their
attempts
audience.
to restart his career. Smaller productions, talk show appearances, a television
Intended to make
project
people
called
laugh
Benny
with
Hill
no
is World
serious
Tour that he
implications
worked
for
on in
society at
1991. None of it approached what the show had been, and Hill did not pretend otherwise.
GQ magazine
Former
stated,
members of Hill
"Pompous
as
and
angels visited
portentous as
him
this
regularly
is,
during this
and
period
increasing
and
criticism
described a man who was
began to
retreating
take their toll
progressively
on
from public life. Spending increasing amounts of time alone in the flat he had rented
Benny
in
Hill
Teddington
Show.
for more than 2
Once
decades.
Hill,
The flat
show's
itself was a
cancellation was both a
characteristic detail. Benny Hill had died leaving an estate valued at £7.5 million.
personal blow.
He had never
These
owned a home.
challenges, Hill
He rented.
continued to work.
He did not own a car despite holding a valid driving license. He lived simply
Albeit
and spent
less than he
modestly
used
in
to.
ways that struck
He was
people who
always
knew the
thinking about
scale
the
of his
next
earnings
joke.
as almost perversely austere. The one indulgence he allowed himself consistently was travel,
The next sketch.
particularly
in
to
the final
France,
years,
where he was
it became
genuinely
a cultural
beloved in a
phenomenon
way that
left
transcended
a lasting
novelty.
mark on both
He
British
spoke fluent French and had spent years visiting Marseille anonymously, traveling on public transport,
while he remains
sitting
a
in
beloved
outdoor
figure to
cafes,
many.
socializing
is
with
also-
people who either did not know who he was or treated his presence as entirely ordinary. In France, he was not a controversial figure. He was a great comedian. The distinction mattered to him. His personal life had always been private to the point of inscrutability. He never married and had no children. His producer and closest friend of 20 years, Dennis Kirkland, later wrote a book in which he said Hill's reasons for living alone were specific and real and not what most people assumed. Kirkland was clear that Hill was a man who cared deeply about the people in his life, generous with friends, attentive and kind in private in ways that his public image as a leering buffoon completely obscured. But the show had been his entire professional existence for decades, and when it was taken from him, the emotional architecture of his daily life collapsed in ways he never fully rebuilt. In 1991, while in hospital, he received a visit from Michael Jackson, who was among the most prominent members of the global audience that had grown up watching The Benny Hill Show. Kirkland was present for the visit. Jackson told Hill he was one of the most important comedians who had ever lived. Hill received the compliment with characteristic modesty and a characteristic deflection toward humor. He had been advised by his doctors to undergo heart bypass surgery. He declined. He told people close to him that he simply did not want to go through the procedure. In April 1992, Benny Hill died of a heart attack in his flat in Teddington. He was 68 years old. He was found 2 days later. Reports described the state of the flat: cardboard boxes, unwashed dishes, empty glasses. A man who had entertained the entire world died alone in a rented apartment surrounded by evidence of ordinary domestic life that had accumulated without anyone to manage it or notice it alongside him. His legacy is genuinely complicated in the way that only things that were once enormously popular can be complicated. He was ranked the third greatest British comedian of the 20th century in a contemporary poll, behind only Charlie Chaplin and Stan Laurel. His show His theme tune was voted the most beloved theme tune in ITV history in a 2015 audience poll. Rowan Atkinson is Mr. Bean, one of the most internationally successful comedy characters since Hill's own era, is directly rooted in the physical and visual comedy grammar that Hill spent decades developing and refining. The format of sketch shows built around rapid cutting and visual gags owes more to the Benny Hill Show than most people working in that format would comfortably acknowledge. The question of whether his comedy reflected or reinforced attitudes toward women is not resolved by his ratings or his legacy. It is a genuinely open question that different people with different experiences of the show answer differently. What is not genuinely open is whether he was a talented man who was dismissed by an institution he had served without complaint for 2 decades, who spent the final years of his life in quiet withdrawal from a world that had decided it no longer had room for him, and who was discovered dead 2 days after he died in a flat he had rented because he had never in his life owned a home despite earning enough to buy several. The show's theme tune was voted the nation's favorite. The man who wrote it died alone.